about the Italian identity. Most people, even Italians, but surely this is true for foreigners, today don't realize that Italy as a nation is a very recent construction, is a construction of the 19th century. There has always been a strange situation by which, on one side, Italy was perceived as an entity ever since the Roman times and later at the end of the Middle Ages, but more as a cultural construction. So Italy was known for its arts, music, poetry, and in fact, our oldest national poet, Dante, talks about Italy as if it were almost a unity, and he lived in the 13th century. So there is a cultural tradition that puts, that figures Italy as some sort of a unity. But politically, the construction of Italy really started only in the middle of the 1800s. And the perception of Italy as a nation is actually a consequence of the spiritual movements of the late 1700s, the ones connected with the French Revolution, with Romanticism, with Sturm und Drang in Germany, when the idea of building a nation of individuals who had common linguistic and cultural traditions became very popular in Europe. So you actually see that in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the idea of an Italian identity is something still very vague, and it is associated with the political idea of starting to unify the different pieces of the country that until that time had existed as separate states, as separate to a certain degree nations. So there's this fragmentation of the idea of Italy that goes all over its history until 150 years ago. And if you look at how Italy was seen by foreigners in those decades, at the end of the 1700s, in the early 1800s, you see that there's an increasing interest for Italy, but it's a diverging interest. On one side, there are lots of stereotypes about the Italians. Since we are speaking through a UK institution today, for instance, there's a famous novel by Anne Radcliffe called The Italians, published in 1786, which draws a sort of a dark image of Italy, something between a Pope-dominated Machiavellian type of country, a country of intrigues, a country of dark lobbies. And on the other side, you have the many travelers who made Italy the destination of their grand tour for their education. Most famous of them, Goethe, the Italienische Reise, who see Italy as the land of art, of great musical and cultural traditions. So you have this ambivalence, but when it comes to Italy as a nation, the statements that you hear around Europe are very derogatory. At the end of the wars of Napoleon at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Prince Metternich, Austrian, defines Italy a purely geographic expression. It's a piece of Europe, it's a piece of the geography of Europe. It has nothing to do with a country or with a nation. And this statement is found also in other politicians of the early 1800s. So what we find in Italy in the first half of the 19th century is this attempt to imagine a future of Italy as a unified nation, bringing all these different states together. And there are all kinds of theories, you know, from unifying Italy under the spiritual leadership of the Pope. There's a philosopher called Gioberti who was putting forward this theory, or making Italy some kind of a federation of states. Another political philosopher, Cattaneo, was promoting that idea, or making Italy a republic. This was more the idea of Mazzini that you may be aware of in England, since he lived mostly in London. And finally, not the theory, but the fact that prevailed was the unification of Italy as a kingdom under the monarchy of Savoy, who were the kings of northwestern Italy. And so Italy was finally unified between 1860 and 1870 on the political ground as a country with one government from the Alps all the way down to Sicily. But surely it was not unified as a nation. The first Minister of Education of United Italy in 1861, a certain man called D'Azeglio, repeated the famous sentence, "Now we have made Italy, now we have to make the Italians." And this issue of making the Italians, giving a sense of national identity to these people who had been divided for hundreds of years in different small states, probably still an issue today. As a reaction to separatism, to the fragmentations of the previous century, we see that in the decades that followed the unification of Italy, there is a strong movement towards nationalism. And there was not much national past that people could rely on in those decades. They had to go very way back to find a time when Italy played an important role internationally. And in fact, we see emerging slowly, little by little, the idea that the model, the role model for the new nation should be the old Roman Empire. So we should not be surprised that after World War I, when Mussolini takes over the government of the country and establishes a relationship, Rome and the old idea of Rome, the Mediterranean Empire, is somehow revisited and revived for political purposes as a mission for the future, as it had been an example in the past. And so all of the period that goes from World War I until World War II is dominated by this fascist ideology of Rome reviving the old days of the Roman Empire. As you all know, Italy lost the war, was left in shambles, destroyed, and the age that followed the last 60 years have been an age of trying to establish a parliamentary democracy in the country. A true parliamentary democracy had really never existed in Italy. In the old parliaments, at the end of the 1900s, not all the Italians were voting, women were not voting, only the rich people were voting. It was more of an aristocracy than a democracy as we mean it today. And so this has been the construction of the country in the past 60 years, an attempt to establish finally, also in Italy, a parliamentary democracy. But many times people don't appreciate that many of the troubles that we still have today with the identity of our own country come from this troubled and recently unified history that has taken the pathway of a parliamentary democracy only 2 generations ago.